You're back live with us tonight here on In Focus, and thanks for staying on. An electoral survey by Brenthurst Foundation reveals that South Africans would overwhelmingly favor a national coalition to govern the country. The survey estimates that voters long plagued by joblessness and corruption would deprive the governing ANC of a majority. This in search of a coalition, a partner to govern with most supporting the partnership with the official opposition Democratic Alliance and fewer supportive of the EFF. Joining us now to make sense of these numbers is Brenthurst Foundation Director Dr. Greg Mills and governance expert Professor Sam Goma, which we're hoping will be able to join us in a moment. We're asking you the question tonight on 072-110-5584. Would you be happy to see a coalition govern? Would you be happy to see a coalition govern? Let us know what your views are on that on 072-110-5584, or you can tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. Dr. Mills, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time.
Good evening. Good to be here.
Let's get this out of the way first. I mean, I've seen a debate around this particular matter. Sample polls, many believe, generally should rely, or at least do rely, on the law of large numbers. Now, you've sampled 1,000 individuals here, where you say they're representative of gender, age groups, and various demographics, and so on and so forth. Do you think it's a large enough number, considering that we've got 26 million registered voters, even if they don't all go to vote, but at least it would be a large number of them, more than just a sample of 1,000?
Yeah, I think it is a large enough number. I mean, one wouldn't want to do it much smaller than that, but I do believe it's a large enough number, and I think we find the same results over 500 polled as we do over 1,000 polled, and we've done polls much larger, and the results don't really change. It becomes a very easy way for people to say, oh, your polls should be larger. Well, of course, every 5 years we have a very large poll in the country, and that's called an election, and where people make their choices. But we've done recently polling across different geographies in southern Africa based on election surveys, and they've been remarkably, rather uncannily accurate in terms of their outcomes. And we really didn't know what the results of this poll were going to be at all. We're kind of surprised by the level of sentiment, for example, on Ukraine and Russia, and surprised that most South Africans now blame the ANC and not apartheid. If you listened to our president the last couple of days in the UK, you would have thought it was apartheid's fault, that everything that's going wrong is going wrong, but most South Africans seem to disagree with him. But we didn't know that, of course, before doing this poll. So that is a significant shift, and I think something that makes polling like this very valuable.
Yeah. So, interesting, you're saying that the ANC is going to drop from its 57.5%, which you saw in 2019. We'll get into what is fueling that. But you're saying the Democratic Alliance will go back to, in fact, will be higher than what they were in 2014 at 24%. What would be driving that?
Well, I think the Democratic Alliance has stabilized, firstly, in terms of its leadership. It's going back to the levels that it had in 2016, and then it suffered a dip in the 2019 election, of course. But it's also a beneficiary of the ANC's failings. That South Africa's politics is maturing, and the history of the liberation from apartheid means less and less for people. People still, of course, vote according to broad identity patterns, and if one gets into the granularity of the samples, that's very much evident. But they are decreasingly so in South Africa, and they're particularly decreasingly so in places like the Western Cape, which have stood out as examples of relative governance, which is another feature of the poll. So I'm not surprised the DA's numbers have gone up. I mean, many people would be surprised that they haven't gone up more. I think they have been limited by perceptions. They've been limited by the representativity of their leadership to a certain extent, but they've also, say, been a beneficiary of the ANC's own failings. And if you look at how many people blame the ANC as opposed to how many people blame the DA is down in the 1% numbers as being blamed for the country's failings, and the ANC's right up there.
Yeah. If you look at the EFF, for example, who've been on their whole campaign of a million members, I mean, the fact that you are still keeping them at 10.7, 10.8%, I'm sure for them it would be a surprise and something that they would contest because they believe that they would be growing. What questions did you ask around the EFF?
Well, we asked the same question as who you're going to vote for. Of course, political parties never like to say they're doing worse than polls. They always like to pump up their numbers. We didn't say the EMF are going to get 10.7%. The people who answered our question said that the EFF are going to get 10.7%. Every party wants to get a majority, but that's where the poll had it. I was slightly surprised that they didn't do better, but maybe the populism genie has rubbed off a little bit, and people are now seeing the EFF in the light of what their rather vacuous promises and the theatre that they bring to places like Parliament. And it's notable that more South Africans favour quite considerably a DA-ANC coalition than they favour an EFF-ANC coalition, perhaps for those reasons.
Yeah. So what would be then driving or at least fueling the decline in popularity of the African National Congress? What are the pressing problems that the people are highlighting?
Well, the things that people highlight are overwhelmingly jobs, and that's the highest figure among black South Africans as well. The second, that's at 31%. The second highest issue at 25% is that of corruption. Load shedding is third at 17%, crime 10.7%, and a weak leadership at 8.5%. So it's really jobs that is driving people's levels of unhappiness. And if you look at who's at blame, the result had that 51.5% of people blame the ANC government of the last 3 decades. 8.8% of people blame apartheid. Even less blame the Constitution. Racists are at 7.5%. And it's very interesting that black and white South Africans are at the same level in terms of identifying racism as a scourge in our society, but it's by far and away a minority now. And then, as I said before, the Democratic Alliance is at 0.6% in terms of those that blame, where they place the blame for our relative poor performance. I mean, our poor performance, of course, is down to low economic growth. And low economic growth is down to a sort of combination of governance, social instability, problems in the education system, and generally a lack of confidence, which relates to things like load shedding. So, people hold the government responsible, and I think that's a sign of increasing maturity on the part of South African voters, that they don't blame the past or they blame whites or other racial groups in South Africa, but that they blame the political party that is overseeing the process of governance. And I think more than anything else, South Africa remains stuck in this very low growth trap. And part of those problems relate to load shedding, leadership, and so on. And of course, criminality and corruption are in the same basket. And the ANC, over time, as is always the case with governments all around the world, will increasingly have to pick up responsibility for that.
For example, okay, let me put this question this way. When you ask the question which provinces are particularly well governed or which cities are particularly well governed, does it reflect in terms of the responses that you get? What is it in particular that those people believe is being done well?
Well, we didn't get into that level of granularity. We asked a really two question, which is which province do you believe is governed the best, and then which city do you believe is governed the best. And you must remember that this sample is representative of age groups, so demographics, racial groups, where people live, and so on, and of course of gender. So it is a balanced survey, and within that balance, of course, there are people who tend to favor the province that they're living in, but nonetheless, because it's balanced, I think it's notable that nearly 30% of South Africans believe the Western Cape is the best governed province, which of course it has, I think, 7 million people at last count, so just over 12% of the population, so more than double that, thinks it's the best governed province. The next down was Gauteng at just under 16%, and then KZN at 11%, and then, of course, places like Mpumalanga and the Free State are all below 3%. And, of course, that reflects very much, and interestingly enough, our audits on municipal governance, our audits on our metros, for example, and the fact that only 41 of 257 municipalities received a clean audit by the government last year, and the pattern of those clean audits, whereas most of them were in the Western Cape, more than half of them were in the Western Cape, well, inevitably then people tend to vote higher for the Western Cape. So I think that's a positive sign, that people are measuring government again by issues and not by identity. And much the same happens with Cape Town. It's nearly 30% of South Africans think that Cape Town is the best governed city in the country, and then down in 10%, the next highest is the city of Johannesburg. And one only has to go to either of those cities. I live in Johannesburg, for example, but I'm currently now visiting Cape Town to see the difference. It's marked, and this is why we have such high rates of semigration into Cape Town, 100,000 people a year, and very high rates of semigration into the Western Cape, even higher than that number.
Yeah. The involvement, of course, of private sector in key areas of basic service delivery is one of the contested issues. For example, they're speaking of the privatization of Eskom, and or at least speaking against the privatization of Eskom and so on and so forth. What are the people saying, particularly around the involvement of the private sector in those key areas of basic service delivery?
Yeah, I mean, the most interesting takeaway out of the survey is that 80% of respondents feel that the country is going in the wrong direction. And of that, of ANC voters, 2/3 feel that South Africa is going in the wrong direction. Of course, that number I think is quite startling, and that of course reflects in how people, where they apportion the blame in this regard, but also in terms of where they see the solutions coming from. If you think the government is to blame, then you want them out of government, or you want somebody else into government to help them get you out of the situation, which is why you have very high levels of South Africans favouring a coalition government, 78.6% of people welcoming a coalition government, but also in terms of the way in which people then see the solution occurring. And there's this debate about whether you allow the private sector into things like water and rail and in power, and most people prefer that, in fact, 3/4 of respondents want the private sector to help provide these key services because they've learned that the government's not up to the task. So, let's get the private sector in to help. And perhaps I wonder, and maybe this could be a question in a future survey, to what extent this result is influenced by COVID, because you'll remember that the COVID rollout was very slow until the private sector became involved. And I think that people can see that, we're all South Africans together, and we need to lend assistance wherever possible. And I think that's quite a surprising, at least for me, takeaway from this. There's much more trust in the private sector in many respects than there is in the government.
So this 80% that says they would prefer coalition government, do they explain, or does it expand further in terms of what value they think would be gained from having coalitions? I'm asking this because where we have seen coalitions so far, they've been very unstable, particularly in the metros. I'm talking here in Ekurhuleni, as well as in the Joburg Council, which are examples that we are currently dealing with, of the instability of a mayor in today, a mayor out tomorrow. And many have been saying, well, there's no value in that because that hampers service delivery. Now, at a national level, one would imagine what that kind of instability would do. So those who are saying, yes, they would like a coalition to govern, what value do they think would come from that?
Well, I think it's an indicator that in spite of the instability that coalition governments bring sometimes in political terms, it's better than one party being there like a deadening weight on the system. So even if you have instability, I guess that's the answer. Most South Africans think it brings a measure of change. But I think interestingly in the granularity again of the response is that people would favour, an ANC-DA coalition, for example. 22.8% of respondents favoured a coalition of parties excluding the ANC, but shortly behind that, at 21.1%, people favoured an ANC-DA coalition at just under 19%, an ANC-EFF coalition. So, I think part of the reason for instability of coalitions in South Africa is that the coalition majority is so small, so people have to, cobble together these very much ego, one or two seat parties, ego-driven parties, and as a consequence, when they don't get what they want, they tend to shake the coalition and things fall off that tree. But I do believe that larger coalitions may bring a measure of greater stability in South Africa. I think what this poll tells us is that South African voters are not fooled. They know what they're voting for and they want to see change. Whether that change is just in getting or voting for somebody else, that's happening to a certain extent. That's why you see the drop in the ANC's vote. Or whether that change is that they can't bring themselves not to vote for the ANC, but they want to see the ANC in coalition. That's another response as part of this political maturation. So I do think it's about South African voters being more discreet in terms of who they throw their support behind on account of the poor record, particularly over the second half of the ANC's last 30 years.
Dr. Greg Mills, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on and helping us through these numbers. That is the director for the Brenthurst Foundation, think tank in Johannesburg, conducting a survey on voter opinion, which indicate 80% of those who've been asked would prefer a coalition government. What are your thoughts? 072-110-5584. You can tweet us at Newzroom 405.